Well, let's start with the Prime Minister. He's called for a crackdown on lawless climate change activists. The PM warned against a new breed of radical activism, and he's been very strong on this. Let's have a listen.
Let me assure you, this is not something my government intends to allow to go unchecked. Together with the Attorney-General, Christian Porter, we are working to identify serious mechanisms that can successfully outlaw these indulgent and selfish practices that threaten the livelihoods of fellow Australians, especially in our rural and regional areas, and especially here in Queensland.
The PM also warned about economic sabotage dressed up as activism. He said there's an escalating trend towards a new form of secondary boycotts. There is a trend with potentially serious consequences for our economy. Environmental groups are targeting businesses and firms to provide goods or services to firms they don't like, especially in the resources sector. This is important stuff, Tim, because we have seen the activists be very successful in not only targeting mining companies, but the banks who might lend to mining companies or other supply chains. And because they're very organised, and in this online age it's very easy to engage in activism, they have had some success. In fact, you could argue they've had great success.
Well, in Melbourne over the last couple of weeks, the entire city's been shut down by these anarchists. They're not environmentalists. There are plenty of environmentalists who have legitimate goals and protest peacefully. We've seen that. Everyone's entitled to protest in this country. In Melbourne, you see protests all the time on the steps of Parliament. It doesn't impede everyone else's life. But the absolute lunatics we've seen blocking this mining conference in Melbourne this week, gluing their hands to the footpath, assaulting passers-by. There was one guy who was just assaulted for wearing a business shirt.
Oh, more than one guy. There was.
I saw on Twitter he had nothing to do with the conference, and they pushed him to the ground.
Well, I think the one you're talking about, we'll have that later in our tweets of the week. He was a charity worker, I think. In fact, he wasn't even at that venue. He was at a venue nearby.
He was just passing by.
But we did have a reporter from 3AW who was there for most of the protest, and he said that was fairly routine. Anyone who was in a suit or a business shirt copped it.
And this is not. This is anarchy. This is not antisocial behaviour. This is criminal conduct.
But what about the next step? What about the companies that are being targeted, not by these sort of unwashed ferals, but in a very organised campaign by...
And we've seen farms being raided. There was a cafe in Gippsland called Gippy Goat, which is now unfortunately closed because it was set upon by vegan activists.
They stole the goat.
Who stole a goat. The problem was, though, when they ended up in the magistrate's court, the magistrate gave them a slap on the wrist. I think it was a $1 fine or something ridiculous like that. The judiciary's got to get serious and send a message to these people that their views about the world do not supersede other people's right to go about their daily lives and business without interruption and harassment. It's wrong. It's just so wrong.
Kevin, I'm going to play you a little clip we've seen, because what Tim said, I think, rings true for a lot of people. A lot of these activists don't really give a stuff about the environment. It's the same group of Marxist socialists you see at every protest, whether it's Anti-Australia Day or protests against border protection. Let's have a look at Andrew Bolt's program earlier in the week. He had one of the co-organisers of this week's protest on.
Where has your economic model ever worked?
I just love that. I mean, I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it, get on YouTube, subscribe to Sky News and watch the full interview. But this guy admitted he's a Marxist. He wants to dismantle capitalism, the government, the police force. His concerns didn't seem to be all that environmental. It was the same concerns he has during other protests. At least he's honest about it, Kevin, I can say that much.
Well, I was waiting for the answer there, and he was obviously...
Where has socialism worked?
He was dumbstruck, and it didn't surprise me. I mean, only the last year there's been research, surveys in America and Australia. We're up to 40-50% of young people, especially millennials, don't understand or appreciate the difference between democracy and communism. Now, I'd say to these young people, go to Cuba, go to China, go to North Korea, spend a couple of months there, see how you travel. So they're so indulgent, and that's what troubles me as an educator, that we now have generations of young people who've gone through school without any deep understanding, as Tim would appreciate, of things like the Glorious Revolution, of Enlightenment, of all of those Westminster democratic values.
The school system at fault here, because these kids, a lot of them are well educated, but how do they not know this? How do they not know the great toll of communism, that tens of millions have perished? Surely that's a failing of our school system.
It is. I mean, and it's not taught. You know, I reviewed the national curriculum, co-chaired that 2014, and we were sort of struck by the number of submissions that put the argument...
You did that in 2014.
That's right.
How has it improved since then? We've had coalition governments in power since then.
Well, unfortunately, Christopher Pyne was the minister then, and nothing really happened.
No, nothing else needs to be said.
And then Simon Birmingham moved on, I think, more worried about school funding. But the reality is, unless we understand, democracy to me is like the air we breathe. Once we lose it, it's too late.
Absolutely. And the curriculum is an issue. And I think you're a state Liberal MP, but I think you would have to acknowledge that your federal colleagues have really dropped the ball in this area. Where is the improvement to the curriculum? Where are we seeing...
Curriculum is not just a federal responsibility. I mean, there is a national curriculum between prep to 10.
Handballing happening,
but the states are still very much in the curriculum game, particularly in Year 11 and 12. Now, I studied the Russian Revolution in Year 12. I think that is a very important subject to teach, as is the Chinese Revolution. And I think those subjects should be taught.
What topic was it? What was it, an English class or history class?
History.
Okay. So a lot of kids don't do history in Year 11 and 12, so they can miss that. I think it's too late by then.
And until Year 10, there is a compulsory history component in the national curriculum. Now, teaching children about what happened in China during their civil war, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, and indeed the Russian Revolution and the communist takeover of Russia and then the broader Soviet Union, I think is very important to show you what happens when this sort of radical Marxist-Leninism, and this is what these protesters are advocating for.
You could just...
This ideology has caused the deaths of millions of people throughout the 20th and 21st century, and these turkeys who are out there protesting wouldn't have a clue. Yeah. It's disgraceful.
And it is depressing because it's not just these protesters, like Kevin said, it's a large percentage of that millennial population who think this is a preferred system to capitalism.